Ever since I was a little kid, I've been a skeptic. I still remember every Sunday going to church with my parents and asking them pointed questions about the Bible or religion in general, and watching them squirm awkwardly when they couldn't give me a good response. But as an adult, why don't we question more things, or be skeptical about more things? From politics to economics to even things as trivial as sports, we often take an expert's opinion or look at statistics as though they're chiseled in stone. But why? Now, if you look back on history and look at the past in general, you can see clearly again and again how woefully ill-equipped humans are to really predict anything. If you look, one of my funnest pastimes maybe is going on YouTube and looking at videos from 5 to 10 years ago and just looking at people make predictions. 99.9% of those predictions are wrong, and probably 50% of them are hilariously wrong. Recently I read a book titled The Black Swan, which delved into this topic in great depth. So for some historical background, black swans, the term comes from the fact that for most of history, people thought that only white swans existed. There were even ancient sayings that were made that stated that you couldn't even have a black swan, that a black swan couldn't possibly exist. But that all changed in the early 1800s when English explorers landed in Australia, and lo and behold, there's black swans. So using that historical event as a basis, the term black swan now means an unpredictable or unforeseen event that generally has extreme consequences. We can easily think of some examples of this, from 9/11 to the Great Recession to the advent of the modern internet. All of these things were not predicted. You can go back and watch videos. No one said, hey, the internet's going to be here in about 50 years. We know that's going to happen. No one thought that. So why are we so bad at predicting these things? Today I'll talk about 3 reasons why. The first reason is the narrative fallacy. So human beings love stories. We love narratives. And it makes sense. For most of human history, the only way that we're able to convey information from generation to generation was through word of mouth. There's no written way of passing that on. And so ultimately, people were able to develop very elaborate stories, not with specific facts or specific details or specific other information that you needed. They just had stories to more effectively convey information. That's all well and good, and as a fan of history, I can appreciate the narratives that people came up with. But ultimately, you have to take a step back and realize that they are just stories. Events have happened, and people were able to put together a story which connected those different events in a way that made logical sense. But at the time, there's obviously black swans, or these unpredictable events that have happened, that framed how history happened. And so you can't really use that as a way to describe the future. And what you may argue is that, okay, nowadays with so much more information, you have so much more way to support your predictions. But in reality, what I would argue is that when you look at the future, you're really just making false predictions with far more accuracy. They probably won't come to be true. And then additionally, you have a lot more information, which makes it so that different groups of people can kind of develop their own narrative, and it leads to, I think, increasing divisiveness and things because narratives are much more easier to develop. The second reason why we can't predict things really at all is our love of the Gaussian curve. So the Gaussian curve, the normal distribution, the bell curve, whatever you want to call it, ultimately anyone who's taken a stats class or even not has probably seen this everywhere. And generally you'll have a statistician or someone be like, oh wow, human height, human weight, human intelligence, you can map this all on a Gaussian curve, so let's take this and we can apply it to everything in the world. The problem is that nearly nothing in the world that's actually of consequence does fit a normal distribution. If you look at income, which is probably the easiest thing you could look at that's most relevant to a lot of people, are wealth or income. So if you look at people in Europe and you look at the wealth of generally in Europeans, and you'd say, okay, let's try and apply the income distribution to a Gaussian. So the likelihood that someone has over 1 million euros is roughly 1 in 62, which seems maybe reasonable. But then let's look at the likelihood that someone has over 8 million euros. The likelihood of that happening if you actually map it in a Gaussian distribution is 1 in 16 followed by 33 zeros. So that's not the case. I mean, obviously there's far more people than that. That's literally saying that there's no one in all of Europe that has over 8 million euros. So clearly, you're not following a Gaussian distribution. And the thing is, that applies to literally everything. The likelihood of how many people speak a certain language, the likelihood of a certain word being used in a vocabulary of a language, and pretty much any economic or financial thing you've ever heard of. Generally what happens is that people will look at this data, they'll look at a very narrow time horizon, and they'll say, oh, this fits a Gaussian curve, which is fine. But if you actually expand that out, there's literally nothing in the real world of value that fits within that kind of distribution. The third reason it's pretty much impossible to predict anything, and why we shouldn't really predict anything, is the fact that how many things you have to take into account to actually make an accurate prediction. So let's use an example of a game of pool. So say I hit the cue ball into a ball. The likelihood that you can figure out where that ball resides is pretty easy if you just have that one strike, right? But let's imagine if that ball then strikes 9 other balls, and there happens to be a person standing next to the pool table. To actually figure out where that ball will stop, you'd have to include the gravitational effects of that person. And let's say that ball hits 56 balls, if we keep on extrapolating this out. To literally figure out where that ball will accurately reside, you'd have to take into account every elementary particle in the universe, right? And that is just with physics, that is just with physics in a game of pool. And that is residing in the world, right? And so that's not even taking into account like variables of time, variables of where that's located, things such as that. So how can we possibly predict anything? So I know, in conclusion, I'm painting a very bleak picture about the likelihood of human beings being able to chart their course through time. But all I'm trying to say is that you need to stay open-minded and realize that if people are following a certain expert's opinion, or a bunch of people are saying a certain thing, you really need to stay open-minded and take a step back and figure out for yourself what the most appropriate thing is to do. In closing, let's imagine that we have a speck of dust, and then next to that you have a planet that's 1 billion times the size of the Earth. The likelihood that you exist is that speck of dust, and the likelihood that you don't is that planet that's 1 billion times the Earth. So in reality, it makes no sense to fret, because everyone in this room are actually the only real black swans. Thank you.